shutting down America's oil and gas industry is not just an atrocious thing to do to American workers, many of whom are in labor unions, by the way, many of whom claim to be Democrats, like steel workers on the pipeline. Why did they shut down the Keystone XL pipeline? That would have brought 830,000 barrels of Canadian ethical oil down to the U.S. to displace that Venezuelan oil.
Moving on to energy policy, Ezra, as you know, the Biden administration has a policy of moving away from using natural gas and petroleum and instead relying on so-called renewables of wind and solar. Now, having written 2 award-winning books, Ethical Oil in 2019 and Groundswell, The Case for Fracking in 2014, you have a fair bit of knowledge in this area. So do you think it's possible to replace our current enormous dependence on natural gas and petroleum with wind and solar? Is that possible?
I don't know if some miracle technology will be invented in the future that makes it possible, but I don't think the math is there now. As Alex Epstein, who wrote Fossil Future, likes to say, it's not renewables and non-renewables, it's reliables and unreliables. Because the thing about solar and wind is just not reliable. It's extremely difficult to store that energy, whereas nuclear, natural gas, coal, it's reliable, it's affordable. And by the way, we don't even know the full environmental consequences of the rare earth metal mining that goes into some of these renewable technologies. But I think the way I look at it is one day we might invent the fantasy fuel of the future that's perfect in every way. I mean, there's a lot of movies about that. Star Trek talks about dilithium crystals. Avatar talks about unobtainium. It's a fantasy. It's a dream. And I hope that day comes. But I know I have to fill up my car with gas probably today or tomorrow, so I can't wait for that miracle fuel of the future that's perfect in every way other than it doesn't exist. So the question is for myself, for my car, I'm going to fill up my car with gasoline made from oil. So what are my choices for that? Well, either it comes from an ethical oil country, Canada, United States, North Sea oil, and I'm almost running out of ethical countries, or I buy conflict oil from Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, Venezuela. And what do I mean by ethical or conflict oil? Well, Dr. Bob, in my book, Ethical Oil, I think of the 4 things that progressives say they care about, and I actually think they do care about them. Environmental responsibility, peace, the treatment of workers, and civil rights. I think those really are liberal values. I happen to believe in them too, by the way. So look at the oil in the United States, look at the Gulf of Mexico, look at fracking, look at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Is it peaceful? Obviously, it's not going to fund terrorism like oil in Qatar. Is it environmentally responsible? More than any other country in the world. They don't care about the environment in places like Nigeria or Iran. How about treating workers right? Well, the workers in the Gulf states are practically indentured servants, whereas in America, Canada, they're making 6 figures. And finally, civil rights. If you're a woman, if you're gay, if you're a minority, you're treated atrociously in many of these countries. You're stoned to death for adultery in Iran or Saudi Arabia. So I say, until we develop that fantasy fuel of the future, we're going to get oil from somewhere. And I put it to you that Canadian oil from the oil sands, American oil, North Sea oil, just a handful of ethical countries, it's the fair trade coffee of the world's oil industry. And this is what I put to Greta when I saw her on the streets of Davos. How come she never criticizes conflict oil? Why is she only going after our oil and gas? And by the way, Russia, its chief weapon in Ukraine is not a tank or a missile, it's the energy weapon. Russia is so wealthy because it sells natural gas and oil to Europe, of all places, because they're not developing there's a lot of bans on fracking throughout Europe. Europe could probably be energy self-sufficient if it were allowed to be. And I think that to answer your question, in the United States, shutting down America's oil and gas industry is not just an atrocious thing to do to American workers, many of whom are in labor unions, by the way, many of whom claim to be Democrats, like steel workers on the pipeline. Why did they shut down the Keystone XL pipeline? That would have brought 830,000 barrels of Canadian ethical oil down to the U.S. to displace that Venezuelan oil. Why did Biden do that? Every barrel of oil that you do not buy from Canada or the United States is a barrel of oil that you're buying instead from some tyrant or dictator or terrorist.
From enemies of America who are using profits from that against America. It makes no sense. But wait, you were talking about unobtainium. Well, there is an answer to obtaining a large amount of conflict-free, of environmentally friendly power, and that is nuclear power. Nuclear power, all the statistics, all the data is it's the safest form of energy in the world. Yes, there have been a couple examples in Chernobyl and in Fukushima in Japan where there were problems with nuclear plants, but they never compare the number of deaths, the small number of deaths or problems, with the huge number of deaths of mining coal or drilling for oil, which are very dangerous, generally speaking, to do, more dangerous than nuclear power. And nuclear power does not produce any CO2. Unlike oil or gas or coal, nuclear power is clean. So I just don't understand. Perhaps you can help me understand why the environmentalists have, at least in the past, been virulently opposed to nuclear power, and every country has such extreme regulations on the construction of new plants that nobody can afford to build a new plant. So tell me why we're not turning to nuclear power as the logical alternative to the current sources of power.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Nuclear power is an excellent source of power for industry, for homes, for the electric grid. I think that for the internal combustion engine or for airplanes, you're still going to need petroleum products, jet fuel, but absolutely nuclear power. It's despite the Hollywood demonization of it as dangerous, it is absolutely the safest form of energy per unit of energy, and
known to man.
And not just the production and the use of it, but energy itself saves lives. When you lift people out of poverty with affordable energy, you are saving lives. I mean, if you want to help the world have affordable food and affordable energy.
Exactly.
You do those two things, everything else takes care of itself. So why, Dr. Bob, would the activist left, why would the Greta Thunbergs of the world want to get rid of the reliable, affordable, secure energy of nukes and Western oil and gas and rely instead on OPEC and Russia? The answer might be, who knows, maybe they're being paid by OPEC and Russia. It would be a great investment. But I think another answer is the need for a perpetual crisis. You are an industrialist, a builder, a creator. Most people try and add value to the world. They go to work and they do a job. But the radical protest left, the Greenpeace needs conflict. They need a crisis. If suddenly we had a reliable, cheap, endless form of energy like nuclear or like the oil sands in Canada or like fracking, well, what would Greenpeace do for a living? They need to rev people up. They need that sense of crisis, especially if they want to sell expensive solar or wind. They have to make other sources of energy more expensive to compete. When I bumped into John Kerry on the streets of Davos, I said, "Are you happy that energy prices are so high because it makes people transition to green energy?" He said he didn't have time to answer that, which is a fair point. But the left actually loves high oil prices, gas prices, because then it makes their alternatives of wind and solar look competitive by comparison. They're not, by the way. I would love a future of clean, plentiful natural gas, nukes, and ethical oil. But the left, they don't see an angle in it.
Right. The left thrives on conflict. That's what the left does, and without proposing solutions.